Hi, everybody. My name is Tracy McIntosh, and my group was doing grief, personal loss, bereavement, and grief. I got the third section, so we will continue on. And what I am going to explain right now is complicated and prolonged grief, bereavement, and mourning reaction. So there's so much to say about complicated grief. To be classified as a diagnosis, only one of the symptoms described must have been inhibiting the person's social or cultural environment for a period of 6 months or more. Things like intense yearning or longing for the person who died, frequent and intense feelings of loneliness, recurring thoughts that it is unfair, and frequent preoccupying thoughts about the person who died. Some examples of symptoms that must be present for at least a month are persistent feeling of shock, stunned or dazed, recurrent feelings of anger or bitterness related to the death, and avoidant behaviors or excessive proximity seeking. Some facts about complicated or prolonged grief. There are precursors, things like severe separation anxiety, disturbances in eating or sleeping. High risk factors include those that I just mentioned, as well as having a child that you've lost, or a spouse that you've lost, or cancer as the cause of death. My dad died of cancer in 2013, and still to this day, I'm stunned and shocked that he's not here. I think of all the things he's missed, and while I do not ruminate, except for the anniversary of his death, his birthday and Father's Day, I do have extreme feelings of loss. The potential for developing complicated or prolonged grief is 6.7% after a major bereavement like that of the death of a spouse, with higher risk factors being female, low income, or older age. Also, it's important to add that sometimes it can take 6 months for symptoms to disappear, or appear. Co-occurring disorders such as major depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety are distinguished from complicated grief because they are already more likely at risk of this diagnosis. And in 2013, the 5th edition of the DSM has classified this as a major depressive disorder, but they call it persistent complex bereavement disorder and placed it in the chapter on conditions for further study. Traumatic death or traumatic grief. When a death is traumatic, complicated mourning increases exponentially. Examples include vehicle accidents, murder, natural or man-made disasters. The degree of trauma is increased by the suddenness and lack of anticipation, violence or destruction or preventability, as well as maybe multiple deaths, and the mourner's own confrontation with death or witnessing violence or mutilation. Survivors who have not initiated or finished grieving for their lost loved ones are vulnerable to suffering from residual trauma, transcrisis, impaired functioning, and worse. It is not uncommon for the griever to be re-exposed over and over, especially if the legal system is involved in things like civil suits and criminal acts. These are clues for identifying complicated grief reaction. There were many listed in the book, but here are a few. The person cannot speak of the deceased without experiencing intense and fresh grief. I have a friend who's going through this right now. Her mother passed away. It's been almost 3 years, and she just cannot get out of the fog of grief. Another thing is relatively minor events trigger an intense grief reaction. And the survivor cannot remove material possessions of the deceased. I've got another friend whose son just passed away less than a month ago, and she is seeking out his clothes because he had a tendency to leave them in other places. And there is one hoodie that she is looking for specifically because she is making memory pillows for his siblings and other members of his family. The long list reminds crisis workers that few grievers display all of the clues on the list. Intervention strategies. Grieving is different for everybody, therefore no approach is one size fits all. The quality of the relationship between a client and a counselor is the best basis for determining how effective the counseling is going to be. And that statement is true for any type of therapy. Being there for grievers. Empathic presence is something that involves listening and silence and support through accepting and encouraging the expression of feelings, allowing pain to be expressed, and responding in a non-critical, non-judgmental manner. Attentive listening and presence are identified as being the most helpful, while avoidance is the least helpful. Avoid cliches such as they're in a better place, God has a plan, you're a strong person, there's no more pain, things of that nature. Gentle conversation allows for memory sharing, telling or retelling stories. The worker will also state such things such as, I'm sorry, I don't have words to even touch how you're feeling, but I am here. Also use active and reflective listening skills, like, I can really sense the caring and feeling you had for your grandfather as you talk about those Sunday afternoons at the lake. Providing available space. Helping the client find support and having patience. Sometimes this means doing things for the clients that they cannot do for themselves. The book gives an example of simply pumping gas for a client. Something so simple can have the biggest impact. Eliciting trust. This communicates to the client that they have the ability to get through the tough times, recover, and grow. Not to be confused with cheerleading, but it is a gentle encouragement and trust that the client can engage the grief and not avoid it. A crisis worker may say, for example, I'm in this for however long it takes. These are the models and strategies and approaches to grief. The dual process model was written by Strobe and lists the following recommendations. Identify and explore both loss and restoration stressors and the specific avoidance and confrontation responses the client uses. Keep in mind that an initial period when the client is fixed and a loss orientation is normal. Identify evidence or lack thereof of oscillation as time moves forward. Normalize and validate the dual process model by explaining how it works and why it applies to the client's particular situation. Address problematic avoidance, such as excessive alcohol and drug use, extreme denial, suppression of emotion, or acting out. Do not push clients toward restoration. Let the oscillation work. Adaptive grieving model was written by Martin and Doka. This model calls for a fairly high degree of ability and skill to operate in an eclectic manner across a wide array of therapeutic modalities to fit with effective behavioral, cognitive, and spiritual reactions of clients. Basically, you must adapt to the client and the way they show their grief. Effective strategies should initially allow for emotional catharsis through a range of what may be construed as negative emotions from crying to angry swearing. Behavioral strategies include a variety of actions that may include substituting a range of positive addicting behaviors such as running, fishing, gardening, singing, or biking. Always be on the lookout for negative behaviors such as alcohol and drug use, gambling, and even over or under eating. Cognitive strategies deal with changing maladaptive thinking. Workers aid clients in reframing and restructuring their thoughts. Spiritual strategies are about transcending the loss through faith-based activities. Cognitive behavioral therapy focuses on maladaptive thinking and is the most commonly used therapy for those with complicated or prolonged grief. Examples include relaxation, desensitization, thought stopping, and more. Therapies used with complicated or prolonged grief include narrative therapy. Narrative therapy emphasizes stories or narratives of people's lives. This represents the meaning of the loss in the person's life. It also helps to reconstruct the relationship with the deceased. Attachment theory and therapy emphasizes separation anxiety arising from the griever's attachment to the deceased, the breaking of bonds of affection, and the need to emotionally detach from the lost object. This blends well with narrative therapy. Our last slide is dealing with loss. The sudden death of a spouse or even the sudden death of a child, traumatic or not, can bring about emotions and behaviors that are completely out of control because of blame, accusation, and fault finding, that somehow you can make sense out of this impossible event. There is an immediate need for crisis intervention. Individual counseling and survivor support groups are huge resources that can help the suddenly bereaved. The traumatic death of a child puts a huge strain on a marriage. Things that would help the bereaved would be assessment for PTSD, couples counseling, assessment of family problems and potentials, parent survivor support groups, and reading and media material. The book gives a good example of dialogue between a crisis worker and the bereaved father and mother of a 6-year-old killed in an accident. Sometimes siblings of a sick child are lost in the shuffle to the point where they feel abandoned. Acting out or attempting to become perfect is their way of lessening the burden of the surviving parents. These children need individual therapy and intervention and a family systems therapy. Separation and divorce are common in our society, unfortunately. The abrupt termination of a relationship is frequently accompanied by emotional responses that are as traumatic as after the death of a loved one. It is a death, the death of a relationship. This loss can be helped by individual therapy and intervention, support groups, and referrals to professionals for more mundane necessities. The death of a pet is a disenfranchised grief. That's already been covered in a previous lecture. People do not understand how important a pet is to a person. I have a dog to which I am extremely close, and if something were to happen to him, I'd probably be batty. Things that would help me process my grief would be individual therapy and media materials about coping with the pet's loss. Not mentioned in the book, but I think is a good one, is adopting another pet. It will not replace your beloved pet that is gone, but you can give a wonderful life to another pet who would be grateful. Bereavement in the elderly, while expected, is still a tough grief, especially when there are legal ends to tie up. Lots of referrals, such as medical or religious, would be of great benefit to the survivors. Research by Williamson Stafford indicates that a fundamental form of intervention with partners and adult family members of persons with HIV/AIDS is the use of peer groups to break down the prevalent feelings of isolation, enhance sharing of personal grief, and promote healing. When a mother dies, the surviving children, usually the eldest girl, feels she is duty-bound to take over for her mother no matter the cost to herself or her family. This is called masturbatory behavior. The book gives good dialogue between a crisis worker and a client whose mother died. The crisis worker must be aware of his or her own grief work and not let it become vicarious traumatization or compassion fatigue. Things to watch for would be the degree of emotional investment in the client, bereavement overload, countertransference, replenishing themselves emotionally, face their own mortality, the need for sense of power, and a tendency to rescue. Thank you.